If I've learned one thing in the course of my long and discreditable career, apart from the fact that the more blatant a lie, the more likely it is to be believed, is that an enemy should never be underestimated. A mistake I have made few times in my younger days, I have to admit, but I always was a fast learner. Where keeping my skin in one piece was concerned, which accounts for that fact, notwithstanding the odd augmetic or two, most of it's still where it belongs. Of course, back in the 20s, I was far more naive, having managed to emerge from a couple of early scrapes with the beginnings of the reputation for heroism, which has followed me around like Jurgen's body odor ever since. And a fine conceit of myself, I had a result, you may be sure. So picture me then, in the relatively carefree days of my youth, cocky and overconfident, and still basking in the kudos of having single-handedly saved Kafia from the insidious gin stealers who had almost succeeded in undermining our glorious crusade to eradicate them from that remarkably pleasant agro-world. In actual fact, several guardsmen and a couple of Arbites had accompanied me. But the Newsies hadn't let that inconvenient fact stand in the way of a good story. In the manner of all the good things, the war had finally come to an end. Or, to be more precise, petered out to the point where the locals could clean up their own mess, with the aid of a long overdue inquisitor, and a couple of squads of Death Watch Astartes from the 12th Field Artillery were being pulled out for reassignment along with everyone else. So, where the hell is Perlia, anyways? I asked, raising my voice above the growling of the Trojans hauling our lumbered up earthshakers onto the apron of the main cargo pad of Kafia's premier starport. By which I meant that it had been a proper Rockreed landing field and some rudimentary repair and maintenance facilities for shuttles that were grounded there. Most of the others were little more than cleared fields, where the shuttles from the grain barges in orbit could simply load up and depart again without undue ceremony. No wonder the Steelers had found the planet so easy to infiltrate. Lieutenant Davis, Lieutenant Divis, Lieutenant Divis, the colonel's subaltern, the closest thing I had to a friend in the battery, shrugged, his fringe falling into his eyes as usual. Somewhere in the Spinwood, I think. If he was going to say anything else, he was forced to give that up at that point as a heavy cargo lifter screamed in overhead, its landing thrusters kicking in the last possible moment, and dropped to the rockcrete with an impact that resonated high and right up my spine to the soles of my boots. Clearly, the pilot wasn't about to take our good victory for granted just yet, coming in as though the landing zone was still probably hot. And given the number of cultists and hybrids still at large, I couldn't altogether blame him for that. I shrugged in return as the howling of the engines died to a level where my voice might be audible. I'm sure the colonel will fill us in when he gets back, I bellowed, and turned away, already dismissing the matter from my mind, content to let Divas deal with the tedious joy of supervising the stowage of our precious artillery pieces. Oh, I forgot. They're Valhallan. I did the voice wrong for Lieutenant Divas. Shame on me. He nodded, absurdly eager as he always was, positively looking forward to next year. I hear they've got a bit of an orc problem, he yelled back. Well, that didn't sound so bad. Never having encountered the Greenskins before, I was sure they wouldn't be nearly as intimidating as the Gin Stealers or the Tyranid Horde I'd already faced and bested. After all, the popular image of them was of uncouth, unwitted barbarians, which meant that, if anything, they were considered a bit of a joke, at least by those fortunate enough to have actually faced them in the flesh. So I plastered a self-confident grin on my face and left him to it. Winithia had taken a few days' leave to see me off, And I could think of far better ways of spending my last evenings on Kefia than watching sweaty gunners lug heavy objects around. All right, something about these novels, as I had said earlier. I guess Commissar Kane gets to be the one thing in Warhammer which doesn't. Yeah, the one thing that's wrong about this entire book is he is a hero. He is a hero. He doesn't think he is, and half the book is him convincing himself he's not a hero, but he gets to be the hero. And that's just so odd because normally, at best, you get to be a tragic hero. You get to save the day and then have your bones melted on a molecular level. But something about these novels that I remember now is they are to the point. They are absolutely to the point. I mean, yeah, this is like I think I oh wow, 413 pages. There's not a lot on each page though. And then I'm also like it's kind of interesting the way they wrote it because they wrote it like a historical text where there's like all these footnotes that are in there, which is kind of it's a cool touch. I think they really wanted um I think they really just wanted to offer something different, and they do. They do. Lunk alert. In the event, the night passed more than pleasantly, and I find myself stifling a yawn at several points in the briefing the following day. The windows of the conference room had been left wide open to admit a breeze, sharp, with a chill of approaching autumn, and I find myself unusually grateful for its assistance in keeping my eyes open. All the battery commanders were present, trying to look interested, while Colonel Colonel Mostru, our commanding officer, regurgitated the information that had been passed on to him and the rest of the regimental commanders by the Lord General or someone equally exalted. In the later years, I was to be privy to the higher level briefings myself, of course, and find them a great deal more candid, not to mention worrying. But back then, I still took a lot of what I was told at face value. Are we boring you, Commissar? Mostru asked acidly, turning his ice blue eyes in my direction. He never quite believed in my hastily improvised explanation for being the inadvertent hero of Desoladia. When my perfectly natural attempt to make a run for it before the Nids arrived had simply succeeded in luring an unsuspected flanking attack into the killing zone of our guns. Mostru was too canny to let his doubts about my character show openly. Instead, he tried to needle me at every opportunity, no doubt hoping I'd let something slip to confirm his suspicions. As usual, I refused to respond, meeting the challenge head on, as though I considered it nothing more than light-hearted banter. Far from it, I assured him, allowing a visible yawn to get out in the process. Bit of a late night, that's all. A lot of paperwork to get through before we pull out. Both of them were true statements, and if he chose to link them to his mind and draw the wrong conclusions, that was hardly my fault. In fact, I delegated most of the routine to Jurgen, my malodorous and indefatigable aide, and was confident that he would deal with it in his usual meticulous fashion. Despite his unproposing appearance, complete lack of social skills, and an all pervading body odor, that could fell groks. Jurgen had turned out to be the ideal aide, at least in my case. For one thing, he was doggedly literal in following orders, unimaginative, enough to simply accept whatever I told him without question, which meant that he had soon become an indispensable buffer between me and some of the more onerous aspects of my job. For another, he had turned out to be an almost preternatural talent for scrounging, which made my life a great more deal comfortable than I might have otherwise been, and probably his own as well, although I was careful not to inquire about that. All the time, neither of us was aware of his greatest asset, nor would be until our fateful encounter with Amberley on Gravelax a decade or so later. But I was to benefit from that as well, on a number of occasions, without ever realizing the fact. Then I suppose we should be grateful that you could spare the time to join us at all, Master replied, not sounding the least bit grateful, despite his words. You know me, I said, nodding as though the colonel had paid me a compliment, and pouring myself a fresh mug of recaf. Duty first. Given the Valhallan's love of low temperatures, I'd taken to making sure there was a hot drink waiting for me whenever I had to sit through a meeting with the regiment's senior command staff. Quite, Mostru said dryly, turning back to the portable hololith. A star map appeared, the Kefia system easily identifiable, and one corner of the cluster of contact icons, marking the positions of the Imperial Armada assembling in orbit. There seemed to be rather more ships than I had remembered, and I remarked on the fact. Mostru nodded, thinly masking his displeasure at being interrupted. That is correct. Our transport vessels and their escorts have been joined by a battle group from the Sector Fleet. I sipped my recaf, which had suddenly become unpalatably bitter, a flutter of apprehension beginning to make itself felt in the pit of my stomach. That meant we would be on our way to a major war zone by the sound of things. I tried to quiet the nagging sense of foreboding. Even if that were the case, we would still be deployed well behind the front lines, far from the bulk of the enemy forces. That is why I had gone through so much trouble to secure a posting to an artillery unit in the first place, so that I could stay well away from the fighting, and by and large, it had worked. The exceptions had been terrifying, of course, but I'd come out of those incidents hailed as a hero, and there was no reason to suspect my luck wouldn't continue to hold on Perlia, wherever that was. I tried to remain calm and sound insouciant. Sounds like a big operation, then, I interjected, more for the pleasure of putting Mostru off his stride than anything else. It is, the colonel nodded, as though the remark had made sense. And it's still only one flotilla among many. Reinforcements are being brought in from all over the sector. The palms of my hands began to itch in earnest. This was beginning to sound more serious by the moment. Mostru did something to the hololith, centering an otherwise unremarkable system a couple of subsectors away. Noticing that it was indeed to spinward, Divis grinned at me, and I nodded in acknowledgement. This is where most of them are going. Perlia. It doesn't look particularly remarkable, I said. Mostru shook his head. It's because it isn't, he replied dryly. Apart from the fact it's been targeted by this. The picture on the hololith changed abruptly, eliciting a couple of startled intakes of breath from among the cluster of officers around it. A couple, older than the rest, flinched, reflexively reaching for their sidearms before composing themselves. An orc, I said. I had seen hollows of them before, and even a couple of preserved corpses at the School of Progenium, but this one seemed particularly impressive. I assumed wrongly, as things turn out, that Mostru was projecting it a little bigger than life size for dramatic effect. It was heavily muscled, as most of its kind, more so, if that were possible, and wore a ramshackle suit of armor, apparently assembled from random pieces of scrap. It carried a crude form of bolter, large enough to be hefted by a member of the Astartes, and one vast misshapen hand as though it were no more than a pistol, and a huge axe in the other. Small red eyes glared with hatred just under the thing's overhanging brow. Not just any orc, Mostru said. According to the Lord General, this is their leader, Kargash Gorbel. He's united the greenskins of several tribes and declared war against the imperial worlds right across the subsector. He pronounced the orc word with noticeable distaste, and, as I was subsequently to discover, not nearly enough volume or saliva to get the true flavor of it. After giving us a moment longer to absorb the full ghastliness of the greenskin warlord, he switched the image back to the star map. So far, they've struck here, here, and here. Systems helpfully turned green with orc contact icons as he pointed. For the most part, these incursions have been contained, however, at least for the time being. The critical system is this one, Parlia, where the bulk of the imperial industrial capacity is. If they take that, they'll have all the resources they need to roll right across the subsector. Then we'd better make sure they don't get it, I said. Summing up the mood of the meeting, Mostru nodded. It sounds quite simple when you put it like that, he said. His blue eyes rested on mine for a moment, and I suppressed a shiver, which wasn't entirely due to the ice worlder's preference for wide open windows. Let's just hope your confidence isn't misplaced. Cats are doing Mad Max shit down the hall. They're engaging in some form of warfare. Oh, the Valhallans are pretty fun. This, I think, is the only book. This is the only book that really ever deals with them this closely. I think it's because their models were discontinued, so you can't actually purchase any little tiny Valhallans anymore. You can get the Kriegmen. You can get... No, I think the Catachans are extinct too. And so the novels about them will just start disappearing because ultimately, what I've realized here is in media, the only media that's truly allowed to be good is a commercial. I mean, when the apex of resources are being heaped out into media, it is a commercial that will receive the most resources. That's what I'm saying, all right? Because it's a gamble it's gambling, all right? It's just gambling. They feel as though the amount of resources spent will bring back even more resources. So it's an investment, right? I mean, I think this one's old enough to still have the list at the beginning. Does it still have the list? No, it doesn't. They used to have a whole list. They just have like a condensed one now, but like I haven't seen any of these, any of these like anywhere. Any of his other, like not since I got this one. So they've all just been discontinued. This is a novel from another time where you can't quite. I mean, I'm sure you might be able to find it online somewhere, but its extinction has already happened. So there won't ever be another copy of this novel ever simply because the miniatures it was intended to sell, or well, here's the thing is I guess that's the shift is this really didn't intend to sell too much. I guess. It talks about the Valhallans, but it talks about them more like people. Um, oh, hydration. This is the hydration station. Yeah, this was something strange, and I guess that's really what I'm growing as an adult to appreciate it is it's just odd. In the entire Black Library, these series of novels are just they stand on their own, and they don't they stand utterly isolated from every other novel in so many ways. But I guess that's what makes them so wonderful. Well, a colonel spoke truer than he knew, of course. But having no inkling of that at the time, I dismissed it as just another fruitless attempt to go under my skin and forgot all about it, determined to make the best of our time aboard the Hand of Vengeance, a typically sturdy troop ship, which had already arrived, Emperor knew how many centuries, of chugging back and forth through the warp, delivering supplies and cannon fodder to innumerable war zones. Though I'd never encountered a living greenskin by that point, I had sat through lectures at the Skoola to believe I had a reasonably good idea of what they were like, and the 12th had been in action against them frequently enough for some time, for some of the older hands to have personal stories of their own. True to form, however, few of them ever felt like socializing with the regimental commissar, and the ones who did take the time to share their experiences struck me as exaggerating. No doubt the intention of trying to disconcert me. They were telling me no more than the truth, or at least embroidering it no more than old soldiers usually do. I was to find out for myself soon enough. They can't be as tough as all that, I said to Divis, on what was supposed to be our last evening in transit, over a hand of tarot in the stateroom which had been assigned to me. I didn't feel much like socializing by that point, I'm sure you'll appreciate, but the familiar activity helped me keep through the day of what we'd been facing. You wiped the floor with them on Desoladia before I turned up. That is true, he nodded, debating visibly with himself whether to draw another card, and deciding to stick. Of course, the 12th never saw them close to, but they folded soon enough. I'm sure you played your part, I said, preparing to prove the old adage about a fool and his money yet again. Standing a long way back from the battlefront, lobbing high explosive death at the enemy from a safe distance still struck me as the ideal way of passing a war. And despite the fluttering of apprehension in the pit of my stomach, the rational part of my mind had no doubt that this campaign would prove as uneventful as most in my service with the 12th Field Artillery had been. Divis nodded. Of course we did, he said. But I can't help envying some of the line regiments. They usually got stuck in against the Greenies. There were two debits by the Tyranids shortly afterwards, of course, but that was beside the point. Divis was a Valhallan, after all, which meant he relished the prospect of killing orcs above pretty much anything else. So I nodded in understanding as I laid my cards on the table. My hand, I think. I reached out to take the pot, comfortably beating his pair of ecclesiarchs. Not so fast, the third player in our discreet little gathering smiled at me. Perfect white teeth, gleaming, in a dark brown face, framed by hair the color of space, which rippled with the highlights as she moved. 3 inquisitors and the emperor. She scooped up the little heap of coins, grinning triumphantly, revealing an impressive amount of cleavage down the unbuttoned neck of the uniform shirt as she leaned across the table. Despite losing a fair amount of money, I smiled in return. I couldn't help it. She was just that kind of girl. I met Carice Strawn on the first day of our voyage. when she'd been dispatched to make sure our vehicles and artillery pieces had been properly stowed in the hold. And it hadn't taken us long to hit it off. She was gratifyingly impressed by the stories she'd heard about me, and I, as you might expect, was pleasantly surprised by the sight of a pretty face in these incongruous surroundings. One thing led to another, and despite the risk of discovery, which we both we which we were both young and foolish enough to find vaguely exciting, we had spent as much time alone together as we could contrive. She had not been back due. she Had she not been back on duty in less than an hour, I have no doubt we'd have found far more interesting ways of passing the last evening on board that fleecing Divis. Never mind, Kai, she grinned, knowing how much the familiar form of my given name irked me. Divis used it all the time, of course, but he was an idiot with all the sensitivity of an orc, and I never noticed how much I disliked it. Unlucky at cards. Before she could complete the quotation, she broke off, a faint expression of puzzlement crossing her perfectly formed features. That's odd. What is? I asked, the palms of my hands beginning to itch, as they did when something looked like they were going to go horribly wrong. Carrie cocked her head, as though listening to something. I don't know. The engines are fluctuating. I prepared to take her word for it. She was a third-generation crew member who'd grown up in the corridors of the ship and was no doubt attuned to the subtle sounds and vibrations of the environment, as she'd been to the depths of the underhive. Her expression grew grave. Better hang on to something. Almost before she'd finished speaking, a new voice cut in, harsh and mechanical, echoing from the vox casters across the ship. Prepare for transmission to the Immaterium. All crew to their posts. Emergency transition in. I never heard how soon the event was expected. Abruptly, something vast and malevolent seemed to sink its talons into the center of my being, turning me inside out. I stumbled and fell, banging my shin painfully against the leg of the table. I staggered to my feet again, trying to ignore the nagging pain still flaring behind my temples. What the hell was that? Divis asked, not unreasonably under the circumstances. Carrie shuddered, looking more disconcerted than I'd ever seen her in the few weeks we'd shared each other's company. The transition, she said, clearly hanging onto her last meal with some difficulty. She pulled her jacket on. I've got to go. I'm coming too, I said, buckling my belt with my chainsword and my pistol around my waist, and looking for my uniform cap. If something's going on, I should be with the regiment. Before Mostru had the chance to volunteer me for some mortally dangerous attempt to set things right. Me too, Divis said, taking his lead from me as usual. That didn't feel like any transition I've been through before, I said. What caused it? I have no idea. Carrie was beginning to recover now, and led the way out of the stateroom, glancing back over her shoulder to talk to us as she did so. The only time I felt anything like that, she broke off, clearly unwilling to complete the thought. What? Divis asked. Carrie shook her head. The navigator died. The wards failed, and a demon materialized on the control deck. But that couldn't have happened. The alarms would have gone off. Commissar! Commissar! There was no mistaking the owner of that voice. Jurgen's distinctive odor preceded it as always. He emerged from the cabin next to mine, his habitual expression of vague bafflement obscurely reassuring. Is something wrong? Very, I said. The corridor was beginning to fill with agitated officers from the other guard regiments aboard. I caught a glimpse of a Catachan major, towering over the rest of us, forging through the press with the ease of a space marine surrounded by ordinary mortals, a pasty and worried-looking commissar trailing at his heels. Confused and angry voices echoed in the confined space. Getting through that lot was going to be a nightmare. This way. Carrie led us through a maintenance hatch I'd barely noticed before, gaining access with a short catechism to a speaker grill beside it, which seemed to recognize her voice. As it swung closed behind us, cutting off the tumblet at the corridor, I found myself in a dimly lit passageway, considerably narrower than the one we just left. Its walls lined with dust-colored pipes, shrouded for the most part in dust. Where are we? Conduit's 23, Carrie told him, as though that meant anything to any of us, and led the way at a rapid trot which set us intersecting oscillations in her uniform. We'll make better time in here. She was evidently looking for something, because after a couple of minutes she stopped abruptly, and I collided with her, taken by surprise, but not so much that I didn't enjoy the experience. What are we waiting for? Divis asked, looking almost as confused as Jurgen. By way of an answer, Carrie picked up the handset of the Vox line and punched out a code on his numerical pad. I'm trying to find out what's going on, Carrie said. As she spoke, I felt a faint tremor through the deck, and if anything, the expression of concern on her face intensified. That doesn't sound good. Gomazar! Jurgen directed my attention to a small data lectern standing in a nearby niche, beneath an icon of the Omnissiah, no doubt for the use of any engine seers carrying out routine maintenance on whatever vital systems were currently surrounding us. Could you find out anything from that? Could you find out anything from that? Maybe, I said. I'm no tech priest, of course. But like anyone else, I've been taught the basic rituals of data retrieval at the Scola, so it seemed worth a try. While Carrie's hushed an urgent conversation with whoever was on the other end of the Vox line, I muttered the catechisms of activation and slapped the power room. The hololith came to life, projecting a rotating image of the Adeptus Mechanicus cogwheel, and I entered my commissarial override code, hoping it would prove as effective with naval equipment as it did with Imperial Guard equipment. It seems to be working, Divis observed, just as quietly enough to disrupt my concentration. What are you looking for? Fracked if I know, I snapped, shutting him up and turning to the keypad. Jurgen pointed to one of the icons encrusting the cogwheel. That looks like a picture of the ship, he offered helpfully, underlining the point with a waft of halitosis. None of the others looked remotely familiar, so I selected it, and a three-dimensional image of the Hand of Vengeance appeared, rotating slowly, flickering slightly in the fashion of all such devices. A couple of points on its hull were colored red, stark crimson blemishes, which penetrated a deck or two beneath the skin like ugly wounds. As we stared at it, trying to understand the information we were getting, another appeared, almost simultaneously. I felt the faint vibration through the deck plates once more. What does that mean? Divis asked. The palms of my hand tingled again. Nothing good. Of that I was sure. We're taking damage. Carrie replaced the box line, her expression strained. The Orc fleet was waiting for us. Okay, I think that's a good intro.